Welcome to the film analysis, today with Tenet by Christopher Nolan. Many suggest the film to be tremendously complicated. Is that so? We will see in a moment, but first let's talk about the suits in this great film. Nolan puts John David Washington, Robert Pattinson and other actors in fine tailored suits with wide lapels plus elegantly tied ties. Washington, who is simply called the protagonist, is even told by a Brit, namely Michael Caine, that he should please get himself a decent tailored suit. The leading actress, Elizabeth Debicki, wears Chanel-style costumes in several scenes as a counterpart. But Nolan doesn't just have a fashion fad, that's how you could dismiss it. No, I think it concerns the fundamentals. Rather, the suits seem a conscious decision carrying cinematic purpose. Nolan is interested in materiality, the surface. He gives structure to the cinema screen also through these noble fabrics. Nolan said that less CGI was needed in Tenet than in an ordinary Hollywood comedy, and he creates films resembling tailor-made suits. Materiality and workmanship are crucial. More impressive now that everything is produced with digital images, as numerous action films illustrate. One is no longer surprised when reality is suddenly deformed, reality dissolves. In Tenet, however, Nolan emphasizes the material to shake our idea of a linear course of time. This course of time leaves traces. Tenet's future flows back into the past or into the present. Time runs in both directions, unseen before, but we shouldn't take it for a time travel film set in 2030 and 1995. No, we are shown brilliantly how future and present meet in one scene. A scientist shows the protagonist's debris from a war in the future. Objects can be temporally inverted. The pistol, the protagonist no longer fires a bullet, but it catches the bullet again. People can also be inverted. We will see in impressive scenes characters moving forwards through time as well as backwards through time. Nolan really takes the forward and rewind we use in home cinema literally. This doesn't happen in the cinema where the film is linear. But Nolan plays with this effect of fast forwarding and rewinding. Through portals, one ends up where an event has already happened or is about to happen. The whole film first goes forward and then turns back. The protagonist is supposed to feel not understand. A statement criticized in many reviews, or people were very quick to attach themselves to it. Many argued that Nolan has created a construct that he himself doesn't understand in the end, and they suspect extreme holes in the logic. Well, how is that? There's Robert Pattinson playing a physicist, and he doesn't make much effort to explain to the protagonist and thus to us how the process works, how we need to grasp temporality. While this may be rightfully criticized, one could as well ask, is all this at all plausible within the film world? Does Tenet confuse the viewer so much that one is only concerned with somehow following this plot? Some Nolan defenders do the director disservice when they state, well, Nolan is simply a virtuoso player and he's merely concerned about the spectacle to show all the crazy things possible in cinema. No, I think we must take it seriously. Another important thing, you don't have to be a physicist to see this film. This film carries quite the logical structure. Critics always refer to Inception, which operates somewhat deliberately with different dream levels. However, one should not compare the two films. Many of the accusations in Inception are true, but they don't apply to Tenet. What is it about? Tenet should first be seen as a James Bond film. A Third World War must be prevented. We have an agent, we have a villain, as befits the Bond tradition, an evil Russian. Then there's a beautiful woman standing in between. Furthermore, there's an Indian arms dealer. Did she manufacture the inverted munitions? What responsibility does she bear for what has been made of her products? A simple plot, really. What does Christopher Nolan intend? It renders the film easier to access. We first get accustomed with viewing habits, only to be shaken by Nolan even more firmly. He shakes our perception of reality and of film. Crucially, Nolan chooses a plot easy to follow at the end of the film. But in fact, Nolan leads through the plot with entirely different thoughts. Unlike James Bond, the threat is not tangible, there is no bomb. Tenet features no bad guy sitting around. Once you get him out of the way, the world is saved. Nolan's work proves to be much more complicated as the protagonist is encountering a horror from the future. That is something that has already happened. And how is one supposed to deal with that? The beginning strikes conventional at first, a terrorist attack at the opera in Kiev, and the protagonist, the agent, wants to investigate. But soon he realizes there is much more behind it than just some organization or a villain. And this Russian not only has a woman in his hands, but as it turns out, the entire world. What must be prevented, however, is what will already have happened. Tenet ties in most strongly with Interstellar. In it, the Earth has become barely habitable. There is drought, but one man does not want to put up with it. The whole society is caught in a great lethargy. We can't do anything anymore. We must be humble. We can't go to the stars anymore. We must tend to some farming somehow. But one man is now looking for an exit for humanity. The famous wormhole comes into play, a situation similar to Tenet. However, the present is not yet as inhospitable as in Interstellar. Instead, we learn that the future will look exactly like the beginning of Interstellar. At one point in Tenet, we learn that the sea level will have risen, that the rivers will have dried up. So what else is there to do in the present when it has already happened in the future? Tenet characterizes the work of secret services well. Secret services are supposed to prevent something from happening in the future, and if they succeed, we don't learn about their actions. The film also raises the question of fame. You don't usually earn a medal for preventing something that nobody knew could happen. Or let's think of a very classic example from politics, the politician who puts on his wellies and stands in the flood and throws a few sandbags back and forth. That politician certainly wins the election, but it doesn't win the one who thought about flood prevention and drainage basins 10 years before. But we are dealing with secret services that don't need this public glory anyway. But that's not all. Tenet tells of the future's revenge on our present and past. When the future is so angry at the present, when the future wants to destroy the present, a problem unfolds expressed in the grandfather paradox. If I were to kill my grandfather with time travel, what about me? Will I be born? But the future wants to destroy the present, although that means that the future will never be born. But that doesn't make any sense, Washington says. Pattinson replies, "It doesn't matter, you should believe it." Nolan therefore strongly emphasizes this ideological factor, which we also feel very clearly in our present when we talk about the future. What is Tenet telling us here? Is it the film about climate change par excellence? Not only do we already have a certain generation conflict in the present, climate damaging policies are made by those who will not live to see the damage. In the meantime, the youth precisely complain about walking into a future that is no longer worth living, determined by older generations. We witness this conflict along with a certain hatred of the young for the old, but also of the old for the young. But let's drop the physical discourse set up in the film. That is part of the genre, but perhaps not the decisive factor. The film negotiates our relationship to the future in a medium predestined. Tenet is perplexing because the question arises as to why the story has not already been told, why time has not been negotiated in this way. After all, Jean-Luc Godard already said in Histoire du cinéma, cinema makes it possible for Orpheus to turn around and Eurydice still not to die. Cinema can suspend this linearity and causality, runs backwards and forwards. Cinema does not have to sort images linearly or establish a causality whatsoever. The technique in Tenet points far beyond its end, far more than a mere spectacle for the eyes. It is, of course, that too. Actually, Tenet's technique enables thinking in moving images. At the same time, fiction has always had a special relationship to the future, as sociologist Elena Esposito explains in her book, The Fiction of Probable Reality. In the 17th century, the modern novel and probability calculation, theorizing how things could be, emerged almost simultaneously. And Esposito writes, future presences will be definite, but exactly what they will be is beyond our knowledge. It's different in Tenet because the future now answers what it will look like. Esposito continues, you can't go by them, so you turn to the present future, which you can talk about in terms of probably improbable. Probabilities can be calculated. One can make forecasts based on them. However, it is perfectly clear that these are pure fictions because the future presences will not be probable. They will not come true 40 or 75% of the time, but just as they will be. The use of the term probability implicitly acknowledges this, but even in this case, fiction is more meaningful than inscrutable reality. End of quote. And we can apply this to cinema. To recognize our reality, which we perceive as inscrutable, we better turn to fiction, a reality that this film makes possible. Art is also a messenger from the future. In Tenet, the prognosis is not vague, but completely clear. It is perfectly clear what will happen in the future, but how do you react to it? The cartridge scene gives us an answer. The protagonist asks himself, well, but if it stems from the future, if the cartridge comes back, isn't everything determined? The film also shows how he doesn't drop the cartridge, but the cartridge comes back into his hand. And the scientist shows him a shot of what he has done and says, for the shot, it doesn't matter in principle in which direction it goes. What always matters is that you made it happen. A plea for free will. Washington and Pattinson later discuss, does it even make sense to act at all? But Nolan is no fatalist. Like Interstellar, Tenet calls for action. Nolan questions the ideology of innovation. Some think that instead of climate protection, all we need is innovation. We need more research and to develop something that will clean up the climate damage of the past. We can pollute the air today, but at some point we'll invent a machine and use it to invert CO2 emissions, so the bullet flies back into the gun. Now, Christopher Nolan does not reject progress in principle. However, he also refers to the Manhattan Project, in which the Americans created the atomic bomb. Therefore, he stresses innovative thinking can be quite tricky, applicable also to nuclear waste. Countries have produced it and believe that some form of disposal could be found in the future, even evident in the organization Tenet itself, which, as we learn, is not just a present one. The future approaches in the form of extreme weather, droughts, etc. Regarding climate change, it is getting closer and closer. The future is racing towards us at an incredible speed. This can also be seen as a certain concealment of facts when some climate activists keep postponing the day X until which something is still to be done. This has been done repeatedly in the last decades, also to keep activism alive. Tenet now invites us viewers, for once, we are to pretend that the future is also already present. We can do this ourselves without a portal. We can, for example, read the book Losing Earth by Nathaniel Rich. The author describes the climate discourses between 1979 and 1989. Sadly, reading that, one learns it's all been there. We knew it. We had the forecasts. Even many conservative politicians had this knowledge. The American military had the realization. And so Rich comes to the following conclusion at the end. Almost every conversation we entertain about climate change in 2019 was entertained in 1979. We do travel back in time with the book, but in doing so, we also immediately experience how the future communicates with us. We can go back in time and reflect, project ourselves to where we are today and realize how times coincide and how terrible the situation is. That's why a writer like Jonathan Franzen doubts that we will still be able to achieve the climate goal if we all just mobilize our energies a little. He doubts this notion in his book of essays, The End of Earth. Franzen says, of course, climate change is not to be doubted. But it is an illusion to believe that it can be stopped now very quickly. It is too late for that. And he describes the muddled situation we are in by the political positions existing on climate change. Franzen writes, the denials of the right were blatant lies, but at least they were consistent with a certain cold-blooded political realism. The left which had condemned the right for its intellectual dishonesty and turned the charge of climate change denial into a political rallying cry, was now in an impossible position. And that is now when it really had to be recognized that it was already too late. Franzen continues, it had to insist on the truth of climate science while clinging to the fiction that it was a collective effort by the world community that could still avert the worst, that universal acceptance of the facts that could have actually brought the decision in 1995 would still bring the decision. End of quote. With Jonathan Franzen, we must recognize that the future has already arrived, just like our Tenet protagonist. But what is to be done? Are we all doomed? Not at all. Franzen suggests that while we must continue to tackle CO2 emissions, we should stop kidding ourselves. He invites us to see what seems stoppable and how we can protect ourselves from climate change. Exactly as in Tenet, we must take protective measures, we must look at how we can prepare for the worst, and we also must initiate concrete conservation. It's kind of what Pattinson says to Washington at the end. The present matters, even though we already know so much about the future. There is a mechanism of the world, but there is also free will. In Tenet, the future comes directly at us as an avenger and mediates between the present and the future. Nolan has placed a villain of all people who loves to let everyone perish. Is that just a bit clumsy? No. The message here is we cannot negotiate with the future. It is inexorable. It is as cruel as this Russian billionaire. Tenet doesn't show a crazy thought experiment at all. We don't have to rack our brains here. The film is concrete. We can't do the maths today without the future. At one point it said we are the ones who save the world from what could have been, an invitation to us. We must learn to understand the future as something that has already happened and act differently in the present. Consequently, we must stop watching and start seeing. It would be nice if you would like to support the film analysis financially. You can do so via my bank account or PayPal. Also, you can find me on Patreon. Thank you very much.